B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Shabbos Daf Kuf Nun Hey. We're going to start the next Mishnah. Before we start the Mishnah, we have to make a short introduction. The Mishnah, as well as the next Mishnah according to Rashi, is going to discuss the preparation of food for animals. Now, we're going to be speaking about bundles of food, of fodder, of straw, and in preparation for these bundles for the animals, there's a number of different stages. Number one, there's a stage that we're going to see in the Gemara where something was before the preparation, the food was actually not even considered food at all. It was not ro'il la'achila, it was not meant to be eaten by animals. The preparation that will be done is actually going to make it into an edible food for the animals. And then there's another stage where it is already called animal food, but the animal can't eat it for whatever reason. Not that it wasn't animal food, it was animal food but needed to be prepared. There's another stage, and that is it could have eaten it, but there's a process one can do to improve the quality of the food and the experience the animal has when eating the food. Well, now with these bundles, there's opening up the bundles, and then there's scattering out the straw or whatever's in these bundles, scattering them out. And we're going to have to discuss the various stages, what's mutter and what's osa. Generally speaking, the discussion here is how much tircha, how much effort you're allowed to put in. There's no intrinsic issa to feed an animal or to prepare food for an animal. If it's an animal that's not your responsibility to feed it, you don't need to feed it, then there could be another issue that we don't want you to put any effort in feeding an animal that's not yours. An animal that is yours, there's a discussion, how far are you allowed to go on Shabbos in order to feed it? Let's see the Mishnah inside. Matirin peki'ei omir. One's allowed to untie bundles of straw, called omir, lifnei abehema, in order to make it available for the animal. Umefasfasin es hakipin. Kipin is another type of a bundle of straw, and you're allowed to scatter the bundle of straw called kipin. Avaloi es hazirin. So we've discussed three things here. We've discussed the pki, we've discussed the kipin, we've discussed the zirin. We don't really know what they are yet. The Gemara is going to discuss it. And all we know in the Mishnah is that pki, matirin, one's allowed to untie those bundles. The kipin, one's allowed to scatter it. And the zirin, loy. There's something about the zirim that you're not allowed to do. That's as far as we have in the Mishnah, and we're going to discuss in the Gemara what's going on here. The next stage in the Mishnah, ein maraskin. This is talking about the stage of shredding the food. Ein maraskin loyas hashachas v'loyas hacharuvin. You're not allowed to shred, to break up into small pieces, not the animal fodder, and not the carobs. Lifnei behema, bein daka or bein gasa. Irrespective of whether it's a small animal or a big animal, you're not allowed to shred the food. It's not necessary. Rabbi Yehuda matir b'charuvin ledako. Rabbi Yehuda says that charuvin, which are very tough in nature, and small animals that are weaker in nature, in order for the small animals to be able to eat the tough carobs, one's allowed to crush it for them or shred it. That's as far as the Mishnah. Let's see the Gemara. And in the Gemara, we're now going to have a machlokes Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda, and there's going to be a fundamental machlokes between them. And the terms the Gemara is going to use is, number one, making something edible for an animal. And as we said before, there are two stages of that. There's taking something that was not edible for an animal at all, and you made it edible for an animal. And the stage where it is animal fodder, but it's not, the animal technically cannot eat it in the situation it's in, under the conditions it's in. You have to do something to allow the animal to eat it. And those are both going to be called, both of those stages are going to be called that shavya oichel. You're going to make it into an oichel. And there's another stage, and that is l'hatriach, which means to exert effort to improve the food. And there's going to be a machlokes Rav Yehuda and Rav Huna, is improving the food for the animal. In the event that the animal can eat it, but you can improve the animal's food, are you allowed to do that on Shabbos or not? According to Rav Yehuda, the answer is no. According to Rav Huna, the answer is yes. About making something into food, we're going to see that Rav Huna is going to say that you're not allowed to make something into food, and he's talking about something that was not edible at all for animals, and creating animal food, giving it something a new status on Shabbos is going to be asa. Rav Yehuda is talking about when something is animal food, but the animal cannot eat it, for whatever reason, making it possible for the animal to eat it, which is called in Rav Yehuda's terms, Shavya Oichel. According to Rav Yehuda, one is allowed to do that on Shabbos, and only that one is allowed to do. Rav Yehuda holds that, okay, we'll see the rest of the details in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, Omer Rav Huna, Hein hein pkiin, hein hein kippin. Rav Huna maintains that there's no difference between pki and the kippin, and the only difference is that pkiin tray, the bundles called pkiin are tied in two places in each bundle, and kippin tlasa, and the kippin are tied in three places. Zirin, what is zirin? Which was the third case. That's the arozi. It's talking about the parts of a cedar tree, that the moist branches of the cedar tree are pruned, and most people wait for them to dry and use it for firewood. It's not really made for animal food at all. It can be used for animal if you prepare it. So Rav Huna says that zirin, what is zirin? The aroza is these branches of the cedar tree. V'hachik omer. And according to Rav Huna, this is how we have to read the Mishnah. Matirin pki omer lifnei behema. The Mishnah, which we said, the first thing is that pki you're allowed to untie. Umefasfasin, and you're also allowed to, this is not a word it says in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says mefasfasin regarding the kippin, but we have to read it into the Mishnah. Umefasfasin, you're also allowed to scatter. That after you've untied the piles, you're allowed to scatter the food for the animal, because food that's very tightly packed doesn't have the same aroma, and it makes it more difficult and unpleasant for the animal to eat it. You're allowed to scatter it. V'hu hadin lekippin, and exactly the same halachas apply to a kippin, that one's allowed to untie the bundles, even though it's 3 knots or 3 ties, and one's allowed to spread it out. Aval loyes hazirin, what does it mean loyes hazirin? Loy lefas face v'loy lehatir. Not only are you not allowed to scatter the zirin, you're also not allowed to untie it. They're muktzah, because these were slated to be used as firewood, and you're not allowed to decide on Shabbos that something that's supposed to be firewood, that you want it to be animal food, and therefore you're not allowed to do anything with it on Shabbos. Omer Rav Chizda. Rav Chizda is now going to explain Rav Huna. My Talmud Rav Huna. Kosova Rav Huna holds lemitzrach, to exert effort to improve the food, ba'oichla torchinon. If it's already food for the animals and you want to improve it by untying the bundle, by scattering it out, you're allowed to. L'shvuya oichla. But to make something that was firewood, so to speak, and turn it into animal food, loy mashvinon, that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. Rashi says it's like noilad, it's like creating, it's a newly born status of animal food, and that you're not allowed to do. That was the opinion of Rav Huna. Rav Yehuda Omar, Rav Yehuda says it's not that pkiin and kippin are the same, it's just a difference whether there's 2 knots or 3 knots. No. 2 ties or 3 ties. No. Hein hein pkiin, hein hein zirin. It's pkiin and zirim that are similar. The pkiin tray, pkiin are the bundles that are tied in 2 places. Zirin are tied in 3 places. Kippin, the arzi. And the kippin, they are the ones that are these branches that are from the cedar wood. V'hochi ka'omar. And this is how Rav Yehuda is reading the Mishnah. Matirin pki'i omer lifnei behema, aval fisfusei loy. When the Mishnah says that you're allowed to untie the pki'i, so Rav Huna says you're also allowed to scatter it. No. Says Rav Yehuda, you're only allowed to untie it, you're not allowed to scatter it. V'kipin fisfusei nami mefasusinon. However, regarding the kippin, which we said, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is the arza, which is something which is not even edible for the animal, Rabbi Yehuda says, not only are you allowed to untie it, you're also allowed to spread it out. Avaloi hazirin lefasfes. Elo lehatir. And this is the third stage in the Mishnah. The zirin, which according to Rav Yehuda is similar to the pki. So in that case, loi hazirin lefasfes, you're not allowed to scatter it out, as we saw with the pki. Elo lehatir. You're only allowed to untie it, and there's no difference between the pki and the zirin according to Rav Yehuda. Omar Rava. Rava is now going to try and explain Rav Yehuda. My Talmud Rav Yehuda, Kosova, he holds shavi oichlo mashvinon. In order to make it available to the animal, something that he couldn't eat before and now he can eat, you're allowed to do. Mitzrach ba'oichlo, but in order to exert effort to improve the food for the animal, lo torchinon, that you're not allowed to do. And now we're going to try and find proofs for or against Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda. Says the Gemara Tanan, we saw in the Mishnah, Ein meraskin es hashachas. One is not allowed to shred the shachas, the animal fodder, ve'es hacharuvin, nor the carobs, lifnei behemo, bein dako, bein gasa. Not for a big animal, not for a small animal. Ma'elav, charuvin dumya de shachas. We assume that the fact that the Mishnah puts charuvim together with shachas, that they are of similar nature and texture. Ma shachas derukichi, in the same way as shachas typically is a soft type of food. Av charuvin derukichi. The charuvim we're talking about are the soft textured carobs. Alma, loy torchinon boichlo. The fact that the Mishnah says that you're not allowed to shred the shachas or the charuvim, and here we're not talking about making it into food, we're talking about it is already food, but you want to make it more comfortable. You want to improve the food. And the Mishnah says you're not allowed to. That seems to conform with what Rav Yehuda says, not with what Rav Huna said. Rav Huna said to improve food, you're allowed to. So the second part of the Mishnah seems to be proof to Rav Yehuda and a contradiction to Rav Huna. Utiyuf to the Rav Huna. Says the Gemara, no. Omalacha Rav Huna will explain it as follows. No. Shachas dumi de charuvin. It's the other way around. Charuvin normally are stiff and hard fruits. And the shachas is similar to the charuvin. Ma charuvin de akushi, av shachas de akushi. The charuvim are very, very stiff and hard, and one cannot eat them without shredding them. And so too, the shachas we're talking about is a shachas that's in the same status as something that's not edible. Since it's not edible, according to Rav Huna, you're not allowed to make something that wasn't edible, and therefore you're not allowed to shred the shachas or the charuvim. Heicha mishkachas lo. When would you find a case where shachas has the same status as charuvim, that it's not edible if you don't break it up, you don't shred it up? Be'ili zutra. Yes, if you're trying to feed it to very young donkeys, and very young donkeys, even shachas, is if you don't break it up, if you don't be meraskin, then it will not be edible for them. Continues the Gemara. Toshama Rabbi Yehuda matir b'charuvin ledako. We saw in the Mishnah that the Chachomim, the Tanakhama, say that you're not allowed to be meraskin the shachas or the charuvin, not for the big animals, not for the small animals. And we explain that according to Rav Yehuda, the reason that you're not allowed to do it is because it's just an improvement. And according to Rav Huna, the reason you're not allowed to do it is because we're talking about that it's not edible before being meraskin. Now let's try and understand Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda argued and said that charuvim for the use of a small animal is allowed. Let's see how we're going to understand that. Ledakoin, legasoloi, from the fact that Rav Yehuda says you're allowed to break up, to shred up a charuvin for a small animal, it's clear that Rav Yehuda means to say only for a small animal, not for a big animal. So, according to Rav Yehuda, that the reason the Tanakhama say you're not allowed to shred the shachas or the charuvin is because it's just a mere improvement, then Rabbi Yehuda is going to argue with the Chachomim and say, no, it's not just a mere improvement. There is a case where it's integral for it to become an animal food. If it's charuvim, which is stiff in nature, and you're using it for a small animal, then for the small animal it's called making the food available, to make the food available, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is allowed. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, we understand the position of Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah, and the whole argument between Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanna Kama in the Mishnah regarding the charuvim for the shachas. According to the Tanna Kama, it is edible, it's just an improvement, and therefore it's asa. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's not considered an improvement, it's called making it edible. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, you're allowed to make something edible for the animals to eat on Shabbos. So let's read that inside. According to how we explain the Tanna Kama according to Rav Yehuda, that the Tanna Kama say that one's allowed to make food, but you're not allowed to improve the food. That's what Rabbi Yehuda is arguing and saying, charuvim ledaka, very hard and tough carbs for a small animal, navmi shavya oichlahu. It's also making the food available. According to how Rav Huna explained the Tanna Kama, that the reason you're not allowed to crush the charuvim or the shachas is because you're making it into food. Then mitrach ba'oichlo matrachinon. According to Tanna Kama, the only thing you're allowed to do is to improve the food. That's how Rav Huna understood. And according to the Tanna Kama here, it's not called improving the food, it's called making the food, therefore it's also. So what's Rabbi Yehuda going to say? Rabbi Yehuda is going to say it's called improving the food, it's not called making the food. It is edible even without crushing it. Well, if it's just an improvement, even just for a small animal, even more so for a big animal, it's just an improvement and not an integral necessity to make it edible for the animal. So why would he say that it's only allowed for a small animal and not for a big animal? Rabbi Yehuda de matir b'charuvin ledako, which according to Rav Huna would have to mean that he says it's just a mere improvement, kol shekein legasa. Then of course for the big animal who's got more strength to eat it, it's considered a mere improvement and not considered a fundamental step in making it edible. Answers the Gemara, mi savras dako mamash, my dako gasa. The truth is that Rabbi Yehuda allows them to crush the charuvim even for a big animal, because he says that not only for a small animal, but even more so for a big animal, it's only considered an improvement. It's not considered making it edible. So why does he say that you're only allowed to do it for a dako, for a small animal? He says dako doesn't mean a small animal. Dako just means umay korile dako de daiko ba'ichlо. Any animal that chews its food, you don't need to shred it up, because that means even if you don't shred it up, it is edible because it chews the food itself. And therefore the crushing it, the being meraskin, is not more than an improvement. According to Rav Huna, even any animal that chews the food, then the crushing it is just a mere improvement. And according to Rav Huna, to improve food, one is allowed to do that. And that's what Rabbi Yehuda said. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. You're allowed to crush the charuvim for any animal that otherwise would chew it, which is a small animal and a big animal. Asks the Gemara, from the fact that the Tanna Kama in the Mishnah used the term dako and gasa, meaning a big animal, a small animal, then we would assume that when Rabbi Yehuda uses the word dako, he doesn't mean any animal that is daika that chews. It means a small animal. Kashya. And then the question comes back, according to Rav Huna, how are we going to understand the Mishnah? If the Tanna Kama say it's asa, according to Rav Huna, it must be the reason it's asa is because it's called creating food. If Rabbi Yehuda says that it's muta by charuvim, it must be it's just an improvement. If it's just an improvement for a small animal, even more so it should be muta for a big animal, which is even more edible for the big animal than for the small animal. And that's a question which we haven't got an answer to. Continues the Gemara, Tashema, Mechatchin Es hadluin lifnei behema, one is allowed to cut dluin, which is a type of vegetable, and put it for a behema. Ve'es hanavela lifnei klovim, and the corpse of dead animal is allowed to be cut up and put in front of the dogs on Shabbos. My love, dluin domir denavela. We assume that dluin is of similar nature and texture to nevela. Dluin is typically a very hard vegetable. Nevela, meat, is typically soft. The fact that we put the two together, we're obviously understanding that the deluin is talking about soft deluin, like nevela is soft. Ma nevela derakicha, after deluin derakichi. Alma. That means if it's soft, if it's a soft nature, it's edible even if you don't cut it up. So if you cut it up, all you're doing is improving it. And what do we see here? That you're allowed to cut it up, which means you're allowed to improve it. Alma tarchinon ba'oichla. So we see from here that one is allowed to engage in just improving food for the animals, and that conforms with Rav Yehuda's understanding, utiyufta de Rav Yehuda. It will be a question on Rav Yehuda who says that you're not allowed to ever improve a food item, you're just allowed to make it edible for the animal. Rav Yehuda will explain as follows. Why are you assuming that we're talking about soft deluin, like nevela is soft? No, we're talking about that it's not edible. It's like hard deluin. If you don't cut it up, the animals cannot eat it. And the meat also, we'll soon see what that means, but the meat also is very hard, and if you don't cut it up, it's not edible for the animal. And therefore, according to Rav Yehuda, since you're making it edible, you're allowed to do that on Shabbos. Ma deluin de ashuni, in the same way as deluin are very tough, af nevela de ashuna. Nevela is also talking about that it's tough, and therefore you have to make it edible for the animal by cutting it up. And according to Rav Yehuda, that's mutter. Where do you find that meat is considered not edible if you don't cut it up? Bebosar pili, we're talking about the meat of an elephant, which is very, very coarse and tough meat. Inami or beguriasa zutra, we're talking about small puppies. For small puppies, even regular meat, which is relatively soft compared to dluin, if you do not cut it up, it's not edible. Continues the Gemara Tnan Toshima. Detoni Rav Chonon minardo. Mefarchinon, one's allowed to cut up teven, straw, va'asfasot, and other animal fodder. Uma arvin, and you're allowed to mix it together. You're allowed to do that on Shabbos. Alma torchinon ba'oichlo. We assume that teven and aspasta, which is mixed together, we assume that it's edible, and you're allowed to mix them together because mixing it together improves the eating for the animal. Why are you allowed to do that? According to Rav Yehuda, you're not allowed to improve the foods. You're only allowed to make it edible. According to Rav Huna, we understand very well. Alma torchinon ba'oichlo. You see from here, one's allowed to exert effort in order to improve the food. How is Rav Yehuda going to explain this? Answers the Gemara, teven betivno sario. The type of teven, the type of straw that we're talking about, is talking about where it's spoilt. It's spoilt teven, and therefore if you don't mix it together with the aspasta, then it's not edible. The animal won't eat it. And aspasta is talking about be'ili zutra, for the very young donkeys, and a young donkey, we cannot eat this aspasta unless you mix it together with the teven. And therefore, according to Rav Yehuda, it's called making it edible for the animal. Making it edible is mutter. Since these donkeys cannot eat, these young donkeys cannot eat the aspasta without it being chopped up, therefore you're allowed to chop up and you're allowed to mix it together with the teven. All these are stages that are integral to make the food edible for these donkeys. According to Rav Yehuda, you're allowed to do that. Says the next Mishnah. And according to Rashi, it seems that this Mishnah is a continuation from the previous Mishnah, where the discussion is how much effort are you allowed to exert in feeding your animals. And we're going to be speaking about a camel, about an egel, which is a calf. We're going to be speaking about tarnagolim, chickens and other birds. Now there's different ways of feeding an animal. You could just put the food in front of it, let it eat on its own. That's one stage. There's another stage, which is a little bit more involved than that, and that is putting food into its throat. You're forcing food into its throat, and even there's two stages. You can force it in a way that the animal still has some control whether he wants to swallow it or wants to spit it out, or if you're exerting so much effort that you're forcing it down its throat to the point that the animal has no control of whether he's going to swallow it or not. And then you've got another stage, which is even more stuffing the animal, which is even more force and in the field of force feeding an animal. So we'll have to see what these various stages are. The Mishnah says, Ein oivsin es agomel, you're not allowed to stuff a camel. V'lo dorusin, nor you're allowed to force feed it. Aval mal'itin, you're allowed to put the food into its throat. That's as far as the camels are concerned. And now we're moving to the calves. Ve'ein ma'amirin es agolim. Ma'amirim for calves is the same as the oivsin and the dorusim, the force feeding of the camels. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. Aval mal'itin, again, the same as we saw mal'itin with the camels, you're putting food into its throat, you're allowed to do the same for the calves. And now we're moving to the tarnagolim, the chickens. Umahalaktin, which is similar to mal'itin, which is putting the food into its throat. You're allowed to do that for the tarnagolim, because the halachas are the same, it's just a different term. But mal'itin for the camels, mal'itin for the calves, and malahaktin, the mahalkatin, those are all the same stage, the same amount of effort, and they are mutter. V'noisnin mayim lemurson was allowed to put water into their bran, avaloi govlin, but you're not allowed to knead the bran with the water. V'ein noisnin mayim lifnei devorim, you're not allowed to put water to make available for the bees. V'lifnei yoinim shabashoivach, nor for the doves in the dovecote. Aval noisnin lifnei avzin v'tarnagolim, you are allowed to put water in front of the geese or the tarnagolim, the chickens. V'lifnei yoinei hardisios, a certain type of dove called yoinei hardisios, you're allowed to put water in front of them. And we're going to try and understand this in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, Mai ein oivsin. We started the Mishnah saying there's a stage called oivsin, which means to stuff a camel. You're not allowed to stuff a camel on Shabbos. Omar of Yehuda, ein oivsin lo evus b'toich me'eho. You're not allowed to fill up its stomach as you would fill up a trough, which is a huge amount of food. Is it possible to force an animal to eat that much? Says the Gemara it is. He says, I saw Hahu Taya, this Arab merchant, the ochla kura, it made the camel eat a whole kur of food, and afterwards va'atino kura, he then piled on top of the animal, he loaded on top of it another kur, provisions for the journey along the way. So you see that it made the animal eat to the extent that his stomach bloated and looked like it was a trough full of food. That's how Rav Yehuda explains this. Continues the Gemara, Ein ma'amirin, the parallel to oivsin, to the oivsin and the dorusin of the camel, we have by the calves, we've got ma'amirin, that you're not allowed to fatten the calves. And it's also, asks the Gemara, Ezuhi hamra'o, Ezuhi hal'oto. The Mishnah says that ma'amirin you're not allowed to do. But mal'itin, like we saw with the camel, so too with the calves, you're allowed to do. What's the difference between the two technically? What does it mean? Omer of Yehuda. Here we're going to have a machlokas of Yehuda and Rav Chizda, a fundamental machlokas that's going to take us right through the sugya. Rav Yehuda says, hamra, which is osa, is lemokim she'eino yechoilo leharzir. If you're forcing it into its throat to the point that it has no choice, and it's going to have to swallow it. It cannot choose to spit it back out. And that's osa. Hal ota, which is muta, is lemokim she'echoilo leharzir, is if you're stuffing it into its throat, but only to the point that the animal can still choose to spit it out should it want to. That's what Rav Yehuda says. Rav Chizda Omar. Rav Chizda argues the Rav Yehuda and says, Idi v'idi lemokim she'eino yechoilo leharzir. Both the ma'amiron and the mal'iton, both of them, it cannot choose to spit it back out. And nonetheless, there's a difference. Ma'amirin is osa, and mal'itin is muta. What's the difference between them? Hamra bikli, when you're using a tool, some type of utensil, in order to get the food down its throat, then that amount of effort is osa. Hal'ota, but is biyad, but when you're just pushing the food into its mouth with your hands, that is muta. That's how Rav Chizda explains the difference between mam'irin and hal'ota. Mosiv Rav Yosef. We're going to ask now a question from a brisa. It says, Mahalkatin letarnagolim. And we saw that in our Mishnah. Mahalkatin letarnagolim, you're allowed to force feed chickens. Ve'ein tzarech loimar shemalkitin. And even more so, you're allowed to do malkitin, which is even less effort than mahalkatin. Ve'ein malkitin leyoynei shoivach or leyoynei aliyah. But those doves that are called yoynei shoivach, the doves in the dovecote, or the doves in the attic, those you're not allowed to even do malkitin, which is little effort. Ve'ein tzarech loimar she'ein mahalkatin. And it goes without saying, you're not allowed to force feed them, you're not allowed to do mahalkatin. That's what it says in the brisa. Let's try and understand. My mahalkatin, umay malkitin. What is mahalkatin? What is malkitin? Now we are taking it for granted that mahalkatin is the same as malitin that's been mutter till now. So ilema, are you going to say, which is how Rav Yehuda explained till now, that mahalkatin means desofi lebiyodayim. Mahalkatin, which is the same as malitin, and according to Rav Yehuda, that means that you're just pushing it in, you're forcing it with your hands into its mouth, but not to the point that it cannot spit it out. No, it still has the choice of being able to spit it out. Then that's mutter. Malkitin is the shodile kamayu. So what if mahalkatin, according to Rav Yehuda, means that you're putting it into its throat and it can spit it out? Then what's malkitin, which is even less effort than that? It must be the shodile kamayu, where you're just putting food in front of it. Asks the Gemara, if so, if that's the pshat according to Rav Yehuda, michlal, then it would seem from there, because the brisa said that the yoynei shoivach v'yoynei aliyah. We said that regarding the yoynei shoivach and yoynei aliyah, we'll soon have to understand in the Gemara later why they're different. And the Gemara is going to say it's because you have less responsibility to take care of them. But at this point, right, the yoynei shoivach v'yoynei aliyah, mishda kamayu nami loy. It means that even malkitin you're not allowed to do. What? You're not allowed to just put food down in front of them? Why not? It doesn't make sense. There's no effort involved. Elolav, it must be, like Rav Chizda said, that mahalkatin, the stage of mahalkatin, which is called the maliton in the Mishnah, is lemokim she'eino yechoilo lahachzir. We said that the different, according to Rav Chizda, the difference between ma'amiron and maliton is that the ma'amiron, which is also as if you stuff it in with a kli, and malitin, which is the mahalkatin of the chickens, that's if you're sticking it into a place where it cannot choose to spit it back out, and you're doing it just with your hands. So, and then if so, malkitin, the next stage down, which is less effort than mahalkatin, what is that? You're stuffing it into its mouth to the point that it can spit it back out. And therefore we can understand there's a certain amount of effort there, and you're not allowed to do that to the yoynei shoivach, the yoynei aliyah. Michlal, the hamro bekli. So it must, and then it must be if malkitin means that you're forcing it into its throat to the point that it can still spit it out, and the hilkatin, which is the maliton, means that it cannot spit it out, then it must be that mamiron, which is also in the Mishnah, is that it can't spit out and you're doing it with a kli, which is how Rav Chizda learns. How's Rav Yehuda going to explain this? Rav Yehuda will explain as follows. La'olam mahalkatin desofi lebiyudayim. Even mahalkatin, which is the malitin in the Mishnah, which is allowed, is you're not exerting enough effort that it cannot spit it out. No, it can spit it out. You're just putting it into its mouth. Then malkitin, and what's malkitin mean, which is the stage less effort than that? It must be the shadile kamayin. You're just putting it in front of them. You asked a question, if for all chickens you're allowed to put it in front of them, there's no effort involved, but to the yoynei shoivach and yoynei aliyah, you're not even allowed to do that. That why should you not be allowed to just put the food down in front of them? There's no effort involved. Yes, a regular tarnagolim, it's incumbent on you to feed them, so you're allowed to do that. But the yoynei shoivach and the yoynei aliyah, they don't need you for their sustenance. They go around, they have plenty of food available. You're not allowed to do anything to feed them. Kedetanya, as we saw in a brisa, noisnin mezoinus lifnei kelev, you're allowed to give food to a dog, because a dog is always hungry and never has enough food. But you're not allowed to put food in front of a pig on Shabbos, because it doesn't need your food, it's always got plenty food. What's the difference between the two? Regarding a dog, it's incumbent on you to feed it. And a pig, not only does it not need you, you're not supposed to feed it, you're not supposed to be growing. And pigs, we already saw that, or the Gemara says that there's a curse to anybody that is megadil chazerim. Omer Ravashi, masnisan namidaika. We can even bring proof to this from our Mishnah. Ein noisnin mayim lifnei devorim v'lifnei yoinim shebashoivach. You're not allowed to put even water in front of bees or in front of yoinim shebashoivach. Aval noisnin lifnei avozim, but you're allowed to put it in, give water to the geese, v'lifnei tarnagolim, and to the chickens, v'lifnei yoinei hardisios. My tama. Why? What's the difference between the two? Lav, mishum dehani mezoinosav alecha. The case of the geese and the chickens, you're the one responsible to feed them. You have to give them the water. V'hani, but those cases in the Mishnah that you're not allowed to, for example, the bees or the yoinim shebashevach, ein mezoinosan alecha. They don't need you to get their food, their water, and therefore you're not allowed to feed them. Says the Gemara, uleta meich. According to how you're understanding that the reason you're not allowed to put water in front of the bees or in front of the yoinei shevach is because it's not incumbent on you to take care of their nourishment. Why does the Mishnah say you're not allowed to put water in front of them? Wheat and barley you're also not allowed to put in front of them. Food also not. Why only water? Don't really bring proof from the Mishnah. It could be the Mishnah is talking about, the Mishnah says you are allowed to feed even those animals that could find their food. But water, which is so common, you find it in the pond, there's so much of it around, it's totally unnecessary to exert any effort to give them water, and therefore water is different. But food you're allowed to. However, according to the way we explained before, according to Rav Yehuda, those animals that don't need you for their food, you're not allowed to give them food. Continues the Gemara. Dorash Rabbi Yoina apischa de beinasia. Rabbi Yoina, he was darshning, he was giving a shir at the home of the entrance of the beinasia, the Rosh Hashiva. Ma'idich it says in the pasuk, Yoidea Tzadik, Hashem, who is the righteous one, knows din dalim, the suffering of the poor. Says the Gemara, what does that mean? Yodea Kadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem knows bekelev, that regarding the dogs, his food is very meager. That's why Hashem specially created that dogs, the food stays in their stomachs. Gimel Yomim, the food they get stays in the stomachs for 3 days. Kedetnan, as we saw in the Mishnah, if a dog eats a kazayas of a dead person, so all the while the dog is alive, then the dead person is absorbed, so to speak, is balua in a live animal, there's no tumah from it. The second the dog dies, in the event that the tumah of the dead person is still whole, it will have all the halachas of a tumas meis. The question is, how long after a dog eats this kazayas, if the dog dies, do we now say that the kazayas of the mace is still whole, and it has all the halachas of tumas meis? Says the Mishnah, Gimel Yomim Eis Leis, a full period of 3 days, 3 times 24 hours. Uba oifos, uba dogim. However, regarding fish and birds, Kadesha Tipoy Leur V'Tisarif, it just stays in their stomachs as long as it would take to drop it into the fire, and it would get totally burnt up, which is not very long. Why did Hashem make this for this miracle or this difference for the dogs, that the food stays in their stomachs for 3 days? Because Hashem knows that a dog has very meager food. Omer of Hamnuna, Shma Mino, from here we see Oirach Aro le Mijda Umtze le Kalva. It's fair and it's right to feed dogs with meat, And some say that this is talking about Shabbos, others say it's just in the week. V'kamo, how much meat should you give a hungry dog? Omer of Mary, moshach udnei, the size of its ears, just a small piece of meat. And v'chutra, take a stick straight away, abasrei, after you give it the meat, and chase it away. Why? Because if you don't chase it away, it's going to start following you, it's going to tag onto you, you won't be able to get rid of it. It's obviously not talking about your own dog. Hanemili bedabra, and this is only true in a desert, in a non-populated area. Aval b'masa, but in a city, lo, you shouldn't give it any food at all. The also lemisrach, because it's going to come and tag onto you, you won't be able to get rid of it. Omar of Papa, lest the anyon mikalba, there's nobody who's as poor as a dog, who always feels he doesn't have enough to eat. The less the otter, there's nobody who feels as rich, michazera, as a swine, as a pig, because he can eat anything, he's totally unfussy, and everybody's giving him food all the time, and he's rich, he feels rich. Continues the Gemara, Tanya Kavaseder of Yehuda. We're going to bring a brisa now that is proof to Rav Yehuda's understanding of these halachas. Ezuhi hamra, the case of hamra, which we said in the Mishnah, ein ma'mirin, it's osa. Ve'ezuhi halota, and what is called mal'itin, which the Mishnah said was muta. Hamra is marbitza. The hamra means that you force the animal to kneel down, ufeikus espiha, and you force the animal's mouth open, umachila, and you feed it karshinim, which is animal food, umayim, with water, bevas achas, mixed together. And when you do that, the animal has no choice other than to swallow it, it cannot spit it out. Halota, what's halota? Ma'achila mu'umad, the animal is standing, it's not kneeling down. Umashke mu'umad, and you give it to drink when it's standing up. V'noisnin karshinim b'fnei atzmo, and you feed it the karshinim on its own, umayim b'fnei atzmo, and water on its own, and that is halota. And when you feed an animal that way, then it's not going to be able to be forced to the extent that it cannot spit it out, and that it can still spit it out. And it was Rav Yehuda that said the mal'itin means that the animal can still spit it out. According to Rav Chizda, mal'itin also means it cannot spit it out. The difference between mal'itin and ma'amirin was only whether you used a tool for it, whether you used some spoon for it. But according to Rav Yehuda, the mal'itin is that it cannot, you cannot force it to the extent that it can't spit it out. We have a brisa like Rav Yehuda. The Mirz Hashem, in the next shir, we're going to continue the next Gemara.